Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a story that is, frankly, gonna completely shatter the illusion of inherent human goodness. It's a narrative that forces us to look right into the absolute darkest corners of human psychology, and it's not gonna be a comfortable journey. I really want you to prepare yourself, because the psychological unease you are about to feel is entirely intentional. This isn't just some dry recount of an old scientific study. It's a mirror held straight up to each and every one of us. Let me ask you something right off the bat. Would you electrocute a total stranger just because someone in charge told you to? Your immediate gut reaction is probably to say, no way, absolutely not. I'm a good person. I know right from wrong. But as we unpack the terrifying reality of what ordinary people are actually capable of, I want you to try and hold on to that certainty. Because by the end of this explainer, you might be forced to confront the chilling realization that your answer might not be what you think it is. Okay, let's dive right into this. Chapter 1, the question that started everything. To really wrap our heads around where this dark inquiry came from, we've got to rewind back to 1945. The world was just absolutely reeling from the haunting revelation of the Holocaust. And the most terrifying realization wasn't just the sheer scale of the systematic murder, it was who actually facilitated it. We're talking about ordinary citizens, teachers, doctors, your friendly neighborhood postal clerk. Years later, during the trial of Nazi officer Adolf Eichmann, a deeply unsettling defense emerged. He literally just claimed, "I was just following orders." This left the global community desperate to understand the mechanics of mass atrocity. Were these perpetrators uniquely inherently evil monsters? Or is there a much darker force hiding inside all of us? Which brings us to Chapter 2, The Man. To figure out this question of human evil, we need to zoom in on one specific guy, Stanley Milgram. Born in New York in 1933 to a Jewish family, Milgram's life and his extended family were profoundly impacted by the Holocaust. He became completely obsessed with the psychology of obedience, especially after watching Eichmann's trial unfold. Milgram formulated a terrifying hypothesis. He believed Eichmann wasn't some one-off monster. Instead, he set out to prove that the capacity to cause extreme harm lives inside almost every single human being, just waiting for the right conditions to be unleashed. So how do you test that? Well, Chapter 3, The Experiment. Picture this. It's 1961, inside a clinical, cold laboratory at Yale University, and Milgram sets up a meticulously rigged trap. A naive volunteer answers a newspaper ad for a simple memory study, getting paid about $4.50 for their time. When they show up, they draw slips of paper from a hat with another guy to see who gets to be the teacher and who gets to be the learner. But here's the catch. The draw is totally rigged. Both slips say teacher, ensuring our naive volunteer always takes that role. The learner is actually an actor, totally on it. The volunteer watches as this actor is strapped tightly into an electrified chair. Now, the dramatic irony here is heavy, right? You and I know this is entirely fake, but that volunteer truly, genuinely believes they hold the power to inflict agonizing physical pain. Our volunteer is then seated in front of this massive, intimidating fake shock generator with 30 switches. The rule is simple. Every time the learner gets a memory question wrong, the teacher has to flip a switch and deliver a shock, bumping up the voltage every single time. And the progression is just agonizing. At 150 volts, the actor in the other room starts shouting in pain, demanding to be let out. At 300 volts, they're violently banging on the wall. And then, just dead silence. The teacher is explicitly instructed to treat that silence as a wrong answer and keep shocking, escalating all the way up to 450 volts, ominously labeled XXX. As you'd totally expect, hearing screams echoing through the wall, these volunteers start to panic. They hesitate. They beg to go check on the guy. But standing right behind them is an experimenter in a crisp gray lab coat who just calmly and firmly delivers these cold, standardized prods. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. So the crucial point here is that these participants were held completely captive, not physically tied down, but mentally trapped by stark, unyielding authority pitted directly against their own conscience. When they pleaded to stop, the experimenter would just say, "You have no other choice, you must go on." And the horrifying question became, who wins, the authority figure in the room or the volunteer's own moral compass? And that leads us into Chapter 4, the terrifying results. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the massive, terrifying gap between expectation and reality. I need you to brace yourself for this. Before he ran the experiment, Milgram actually asked Yale psychology majors and top psychiatrists what they thought would happen. These experts confidently predicted that only a tiny fraction, about 0.1% of people, would actually push that final 450-volt switch. The actual reality, a staggering 65%. Two-thirds of ordinary, everyday people went all the way to the absolute maximum voltage. They became agents of destruction simply because someone told them to. But honestly, the number that creates the most psychological unease is this one right here, 100%. Literally every single participant went past the 300-volt mark. Let that sink in. Not one single person stopped before the victim started desperately banging on the wall in agony. Every single one of them pushed past their own initial hesitation and delivered what they completely believed to be excruciating shocks. Now, it is absolutely vital to understand that these participants were not sadists. They weren't enjoying this even a little bit. In fact, their physical reactions were horrific to watch. They were sweating buckets, trembling, stuttering, and biting their own lips until they bled. Some were digging their fingernails so hard into their own flesh they were leaving marks. You saw bizarre, uncontrollable fits of nervous laughter, and in some extreme cases, the intense internal conflict actually triggered full-blown, stress-induced physical seizures. They were literally tearing themselves apart on the inside, yet their hands just kept pressing those switches. Milgram gave a name to this deeply unsettling phenomenon. He called it the agentic state. And look, don't just think of this as some dry academic term. Think of it as a chilling diagnosis of human vulnerability. It's the psychological shift where a person completely abdicates personal responsibility. They stop seeing themselves as individuals making choices, and instead, they just view themselves merely as an instrument of an authority figure's will. And the truly terrifying thing about being an instrument? Instruments dump no guilt. Let's pull back and look at Chapter 5, The Connection. And this brilliantly illustrates how we map a controlled lab test onto real, messy history. Now, we have to be careful with nuance here. Historians rightly point out that Milgram's lab setting was brief, the authority was scientifically justified, and participants were explicitly promised there'd be no permanent tissue damage. The Holocaust, on the other hand, that was prolonged, deeply hate-driven, and rooted in complex ideological and cultural racism sustained by relentless propaganda. Real-world genocide definitely involves layers of sustained brutality that you just can't perfectly recreate in a one-hour lab experiment. Yet despite those obvious differences, Milgram's core findings perfectly explain the routinization of destructiveness we see time and time again in history. It helps explain soldiers executing civilians at the Milgram Massacre in 1968. It explains how over 900 people died in Jonestown in 1978 because they had entered the agentic state under Jim Jones's absolute authority. It explains how in 2013, over 3,600 garment workers in Bangladesh walked into a visibly cracked, condemned building at Rana Plaza because factory management held absolute economic authority over them. Replicated across decades and entirely different cultures, this extreme willingness to obey authority is clearly not just some regional flaw. It is a deeply ingrained human problem. Let's move to Chapter 6, What This Means for You. Let's see how this builds into your own life. Right now, today, who holds authority over you? Is it your employer who pays your bills, your government, your religious institution, or maybe even that social circle you so desperately want to fit into? Now, the Milgram experiment doesn't mean obedience is inherently evil. Obviously, society requires obedience to function properly. But it serves as a glaring, terrifying warning light that the capacity to cause serious harm to others while feeling zero personal responsibility is not something that only monsters possess. It is something that lives inside you, too. The only real protection against becoming an instrument of destruction is the exact same thing Milgram's few disobedient participants relied on. It's the ability to just pause in that critical moment. The moment an authority figure asks you to do something, will you stop and ask yourself not what they want, but what you fundamentally believe is right? I want to leave you sitting with that profound discomfort for a minute. If this explainer made you look at events like Jonestown or Rana Plaza in a new light, we've got full documentaries on both right here on the channel. Links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching Dark Chronicles. Real stories, verified sources. Follow for more.